So our next conversation, regulatory reform lifts all boats. Please welcome, on the inside, by the way, Dustin Chambers of Mercatus Center, a professor of economics at Purdue School of Business, and Frank Gamrat, executive director of the Allegheny Institute for Public Policy. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Frank Gamrat, and I'm the Executive Director of the Allegheny Institute for Public Policy in Pittsburgh. Joining me today is Dr. Dustin Chambers from the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Dr. Chambers, how are you today?
Doing great, thank you so much.
The topic today is regulatory reform lifts all boats. And we were talking in the hallway, and I had lunch on Tuesday talking about this conversation. And a gentleman that owned a car dealership sat next to us and says, I couldn't help but overhearing. And he relayed to me his story. He owned a Toyota dealership in Northern Virginia, and to get that dealership, he had to fill out 25 pages of regulations. I thought, wow, that's a lot. He's buying one in Western Pennsylvania, Moon Township. He had to fill out 192 pages of regulations to own a car dealership in Pennsylvania. That's a lot. So, Dustin, you wrote a paper called The Human Cost of Regulations and Some Possible Solutions back in November of 22. In your paper, you mentioned that, quote, regulations against targeted industries often have negative and unanticipated effects on low-income communities and individuals. Could you please elaborate?
Sure, absolutely. For a long time in economics, it was well understood that properly crafted regulations are really important in order to protect the environment, workers, for consumer safety. But there really wasn't a lot of thought into the unintended consequences of regulation. And that really began to shift in the 1960s with Milton Friedman and other influential economists at the University of Chicago. And what they discovered was that regulations, part of it's common sense, obviously drive up the cost of producing things. So that tends to have a chilling effect on employment, wages, it boosts the costs of anything that you'd want to buy. But at the same time, there were some other more subtle but insidious effects of regulation, including the use of regulations to keep competitors out of industries. So it's basically a barrier to entry that reduces innovation, that drives up the cost of products that you'd want to purchase, gives consumers less choice. So there's a lot of these more subtle, indirect effects of regulation. And what we have discovered with subsequent research in the last 10 years is that these regulations, apart from hurting everybody, these red tape also has the effect of hammering low-income and vulnerable populations.
You said barriers to entry. Anybody took a Principles of Micro class just had a cold chill go down their spine.
I did mention opportunity cost, though.
Oh, there you go. Put them to sleep next.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
You also say that many economists call these regressive effects, in that higher levels of regulation are associated with higher levels of income inequality, poverty, and increased morality rates. How do regulations promote income inequality?
That's a great question. The basic idea is that individuals who are more educated, who have higher levels of income, are able to adapt to regulations. They can hire accountants, lawyers. They're able to navigate the regulatory minefield better. Lower income individuals, by contrast, tend to be stopped in their tracks in the face of regulations. So think about a would-be entrepreneur. If they're not able to manage and move through that minefield of regulations, they never start their business. If you're a low-income worker that wants to go into hair braiding in Pennsylvania, you have to do 300 hours of training. You have to take a theoretical exam. So that entry into that profession, while it's not going to make you rich, might be enough to lift you out of poverty. So by shutting the door in the face of individuals who want to climb the income ladder, you tend to have a disparate impact on lower income individuals. We see more income inequality, we see higher levels of poverty, and there's a tight relationship between income and mortality. So it's not too surprising that when you reduce incomes to vulnerable populations, you also see negative effects on mortality. People die at a younger age.
And that's important to keep in mind, is that there's a snowball effect. Like you said, the unintended consequences of, I think the start of your paper says the road to heck is paved with good intentions.
Right,
and
right.
A lot of times when people come up with, oh, I need this regulation passed to protect this thing,
right,
then there's bad effects elsewhere that they don't necessarily see right away.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Now, you also had a paper from back in 2020 talking about the effects of regulation in Pennsylvania. And I know you have some statistics. As data geeks like us, data is available. We like to look at it. How have federal regulations affected those of us in Pennsylvania with regard to inequality and poverty? Let's start there.
Okay, if you look up to the year 2019, so this doesn't include the pandemic, in Pennsylvania, it's estimated that 187,000 additional individuals were living in poverty due to just federal regulations. So this doesn't include state regs or county or municipal regulations, just federal regulations. It also drove up income inequality by about 3%. So it's important to point these things out because many of the folks who fight against reform say that, regulations are absolutely necessary to protect the poor, and it's just a trade-off we're going to have to live with. But this research shows that the emperor has no clothes, that regulations, not only do they generally do a fairly poor job of achieving their stated objectives, they also have the problem that they tend to hurt the people they claim that they're trying to protect.
Okay. You mentioned businesses and jobs earlier, specific entrepreneurship. What did your research show for entrepreneurs and jobs in Pennsylvania?
It reduces the total number of businesses by about 350 per year. So that's every single year, so it compounds over time. And about 5,200 jobs are lost in Pennsylvania due to just the federal regulations alone. And this doesn't include all of the new regulations that have come out under the Biden administration. It doesn't include state level regs.
Right. Yeah. Your research went from what, 1997 to
2019.
2019. So we're talking again pre-pandemic, where boy, we sure could use that influx of jobs right now, and Absolutely. We could use the influx of entrepreneurial spirit. You also mentioned consumer prices earlier. How do regulations affect consumer prices in Pennsylvania?
Well, it just increases the cost of everything. The compliance costs are very, very high. We estimated that it drove up consumer prices from the late 90s to about 2015. This was an older paper. So this is, pre-high inflation, like what we're seeing now, by a little over 7%. So it's not a huge amount, but it's like 2 years of normal inflation or 1 year of kind of the high inflation that we've been experiencing. And when you listen to a lot of vulnerable folks talk about how they struggle to put food on the table or put fuel in their car, 8% is still, it's meaningful. It does have a significant impact on a lot of people.
And I think you hit a very important point here. The regulations impose a cost on the business. The costs are then passed along to consumers. Someone has to pay for this thing. Someone has to, and to the best of their ability, business owners and managers will have to pass that along to the consumers. And of course, that means that we all have to pay more somewhere along the line because we have to pay for what happens in Harrisburg, in our case, if not DC. Now, you mentioned the hair braiding. How does Pennsylvania rank against other states in occupational licensure?
Pennsylvania is about in the middle. So if you rank the 50 states, Pennsylvania is number 31. You don't want to be number 1 in this poll. You want to be 50. So it's about in the middle. Let's see. There are 51 low-income occupations specifically that are licensed in Pennsylvania. Now, it makes sense. When I fly home to Maryland tomorrow, I want a licensed pilot flying the plane. I mean, there are common sense areas where you want occupational licensing, But a lot of these professions, it really doesn't improve the quality of the product, doesn't promote consumer safety or any of those things. So hair braiding is one of the egregious examples here in Pennsylvania. But states are very creative at coming up with ways to basically limit competition and boost their wages. In Louisiana, you have to be licensed to be a florist. And so there was a study that compared flower arrangements in Texas versus Louisiana. And surprise, surprise, no difference in quality, just a lot higher prices in the regulated state. So there needs to be a real concerted effort to try to roll back a lot of these, pointless occupational licensing rules.
One of the other rankings that I'd like to mention is you ranked Pennsylvania 11th in the regulatory environment in your study. And again, you don't want to be number one, you want to be closer to 50. Who was number one again?
California.
California. So we're only 10 spots away from California in the regulatory environment platform. Very nice.
Yes, and for those of you who are familiar, your neighboring state, Pennsylvania, Ohio, is reducing their total regulatory count by about a third. So I was in Ohio a few weeks ago for a press conference, and they actually identified the regs that they're going to cut through their budget reconciliation process. So Ohio's currently number 4 in the nation, but they're probably going to drop out of the top 10, which means if Pennsylvania doesn't do anything, they're going to slide into the top 10 in that particular category.
There are some other states that have done a little bit more to reduce the regulatory burden. You also mentioned Arizona and Idaho. Idaho seems to stand out because they took one old stroke of a pen and did away with a handful of things. Could you please elaborate?
Yeah, it's interesting. Not all states are set up this way, but in Idaho, all of their regulations have sunset provisions, and they all sunset at the same time. So Governor Little decided to not reauthorize those regulations. So in one fell swoop, 175,000 regs went out the window. They then quickly reauthorized critically important safety regulations, but they pushed back on allowing the other regulations back into the administrative code. They then pushed the actual agencies to justify the regulations that they wanted to reintroduce. And what's very innovative is they make the secretary of each cabinet level department sign off on those regulations. So the buck has to stop with leadership within each of those agencies. So all told, they ended up reducing regulation 75%. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Idaho is also the fastest growing state in the nation. They've just introduced a new lower flat income tax, and they're rebating income back to state residents because they have such huge budget surpluses.
Yeah, our own research at the Allegheny Institute, and you can check us out at alleghenyinstitute.org on the web, showed that Boise, Idaho is one of the fastest growing metro areas in the country. And those of us in Pittsburgh, we know what it's like to not have growth in the first 20 years of this century. And so Idaho can certainly be a nice model. You also mentioned British Columbia, Canada, and I know Canada is different, but they also took on the regulatory reform with both hands and had some very good economic success in response.
They did. In the late 1990s, British Columbia was one of the worst performing provinces in Canada. They basically had run out of other people's money, and the only thing that they had left was the ability to craft new rules. It was so nuts. They were regulating the size of television screens in restaurants, the number of par threes on golf courses, the size of the nails that you had to put into footbridges. I mean, just bizarre things. And consequently, there was no growth in that province. People got fed up. They pushed for reform government. And they did a lot of other things, too. They cut taxes. But the crown jewel of their reform efforts were to cut regulations by 30%. And like Idaho, they went from one of the slowest growing provinces to the fastest growing province in the course of about 10 years. And here's the interesting thing. They were the first to come up with this 30% reduction target. Lots of other states have now done this in the U.S., like Ohio and Arizona. But what they found was that when they hit the 30% threshold, they didn't stop. They kept going and ended up cutting about half of all of their regulations. So it's a sign that even in the United States, probably a good 40 to 50% of all the regulations on the books are probably red tape in most states. And even those regulations that need to be there, in other words, if we agree that there's a particular activity that needs to be regulated, oftentimes the way those regulations are crafted are very poor. They don't follow best practices. They tend to be highly prescriptive. So the regulator, basically it's central planning, is telling the industry how they are to mitigate that risk, rather than allowing them to be more innovative and come up with ways to mitigate those risks. So an example would be like catalytic converters on cars. So at the federal level for many years, there was a federal regulation saying that to have pollution abatement on vehicles, you had to put a catalytic converter in the cars. Bad way to do it. It's better to just set a target in terms of how much emission reductions you would want in a car and leave it up to the automakers to come up with the best technology to achieve that goal. So there's a lot of these kind of backward, very prescriptive top-down type of regulations on both the federal and state level, and those need to be thoroughly revised and revisited.
Now, in your papers, you had mentioned that some states, British Columbia, and even the presidency of Donald Trump, where they said for every regulation you input, you have to remove 2 or 3. Is that a good strategy for Pennsylvania to kind of start with?
Absolutely, and that seems to be how most states start out. They create a system where they say, okay, we have to first agree upon a metric. How are we going to measure regulations? Once we have that, we then set a reduction target, and then to kind of kickstart the process, usually there's a 1 in, 3 out or 1 in, 2 out type system to force the various agencies to reduce the number of total regulations. And then at that point, once you hit the target, it usually goes to a 1 in, 1 out type system. So basically, you're going to cap the number of total regulations. And then different states have put different wrinkles on it. Some have regulatory budgeting rules in terms of the cost of regulations. So it can vary. But what we found, particularly in British Columbia, was that it changed the mindset and the culture of the regulating agencies themselves. In the U.S. and even at the federal level, there seems to be this mindset that the job of a regulator is to regulate. So if you're not creating new rules, you're not doing your job. And so it's a bad mindset. In Canada, they began to have more of a regulatory portfolio mindset. So the thinking was, no, my job's not to create new rules, it's to be a good steward over this amount of regulatory headspace that I have, and then have the best possible rules within it, always looking for poor performing rules that you can then cut to make room to perhaps draft better rules in new and emerging areas. So it creates kind of more of an ongoing management mindset than just mindlessly creating new rules.
Well, I think you said it best. Sometimes lawmakers think that their job is to create regulations to justify their existence. But we as Pennsylvanians have to do a better job of minding our legislators and reminding them that reducing regulations can be every bit as powerful as enacting new laws to help us grow. Yeah.
That's correct. And what I've seen over and over, because I've been to a lot of states, I've talked to a lot of governor's offices and state legislators, is that there tends to be a lot of lawmakers who think, and I'm a big believer in checks and balances, but that you're going to use the legislative branch as a check and balance against this fourth branch of government, this administrative state. And the problem is it's a David and Goliath type of battle. If you look at just one federal agency, Health and Human Services, HHS has 80,000 employees. It has a budget that would make it, I think, the 8th largest country in the world if it were just a country by itself, because Medicare and Social Security and all of these things are within HHS's purview. So it's not a fair fight. you have to change your systems and you have to compel the administrative agencies to clean up their own mess. We sometimes call this the kindergarten principle. I like to think of it as a preemptive check and balance. So the legislative branch is exercising its proper authority and is telling the agencies ahead of time that you must operate your agency within these boundaries and rules.
Kindergarten principle. You know our legislature well, don't you? Yeah. Well, Dr. Chambers, thank you so much for the insights, and hopefully Pennsylvania can begin cutting regulations to help us grow and prosper. On behalf of Dr. Chambers and the Mercatus Center, I am Frank Gamrat with the Allegheny Institute. Thank you all for listening, and enjoy the rest of the conference.